When the Cold War had ended, a power vacuum was left in many underdeveloped and struggling places in the world. And the Chinese quickly rose to help fill that power vacuum. We see the late 80s and the 90s are a time of intense conflict in the Middle East, in Africa, in parts of Asia. But at the same time, and equally importantly, this is a time of innovation and transformation in the United States and globally. The computer revolution of the 1990s had been building since the first computers were developed during World War II. By the 1970s, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs had begun to market microcomputers for home and business use. By 1980, Apple Computer Company had become a publicly traded corporation. In the 1980s, microchips and digital technology fueled developments in appliances such as dishwashers, washing machines, refrigerators, and computerization transformed other technologies like televisions, phones, VCRs, CD players, fax machines, cell phones, and iPods, as well as of air traffic and traffic lights. Now, you might not be familiar with a VCR or a fax machine or possibly even a CD player, but these are older technologies that were a little bit bigger than you're accustomed to today, but they were significantly smaller than had been available in earlier times, but they allowed for the ability of Americans to conduct business not just down the street, but across the country and ultimately across the world. Computers also became an important force in consumer culture, popular culture, and socialization, with films like The Matrix from 1999 and Artificial Intelligence from 2001, and then Iron Man in 2008, that all feature computers garnering large audiences. Companies such as Amazon selling goods to people shopping in cyberspace also began to take rise. In the 1970s, the Department of Defense fueled the interconnected computer systems to link military communications in the event of a Soviet attack. By 1991, the World Wide Web offered ordinary Americans the opportunity to share documents, access web pages, search for information, find academic materials, and contribute to political campaigns. Around a quarter of the world's population was online by 2010. Computer technology facilitated a rapid expansion of business by connecting employees and firms spread across geographic space. The government aided this process by easing financial regulations. Businesses merged at a rapid pace, with a number of mergers increasing from about 1,500 in 1999 to more than 4,500 in 1998. This growth was rapid and fostered corrupt business practices. In 1985, Houston Natural Gas merged with InterNorth, a gas company based in Omaha, Nebraska, to create a company called Enron. By 2001, the company was earning more than $50 billion annually. By the fall of 2001, insider trading, bad deals, and questionable accounting practices led at Enron began to be revealed. In December, Enron's stock fell so significantly that the company filed for bankruptcy. The company fired 4,000 employees, and its two top executives were eventually convicted on counts of criminal fraud. Immigration had a significant impact on the transformations in American society, and at the end of the 20th century, the influx of immigrants was similar to the wave of immigration at the beginning of the century. Between 1970 and 2006, more than 28 million immigrants entered into the United States. The majority of immigrants came to the United States from Latin America and South and East Asia. Most were pursuing political or religious freedom, along with economic opportunity. By the turn of the 21st century, Latinos were a larger minority than African Americans, but African American culture was also changing as migrants from the Caribbean and Africa also entered into the United States. Other nations heavily represented the surge of immigration as well. Some of those were Vietnam, Cambodia, China, Korea, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. By 2001, more than a quarter of the population of California was foreign-born, and major northeastern and midwestern cities were seeing an influx of immigrants. Southern cities also became increasingly diverse. Native-born Americans treated newcomers with hostility, and the middle class complained that their tax dollars were subsidizing the health and welfare of poor immigrants. Immigration critics also directed angst at illegal foreign residents. In 1983, California approved Proposition 63, which made English the state's official language. And in 1994, they approved Proposition 186, which barred illegal immigrants from attending public schools and using social services. The federal courts rejected the latter proposal as unconstitutional. Now, this chart is an immigration graph, and it indicates the different nations that immigrants are coming to the United States from, and it shows you the numbers of those immigrants over the course of these 3 different decades. Now, if you are looking closely at that, you'll see that Africa has the smallest number of immigrants that are moving. And so what that tells us is that we don't necessarily see a lot of immigration from Africa into the United States, but we do see significant immigration from South America, from Asia, and we see an interesting decline in immigration from Europe through this particular time period. William Jefferson Clinton was a 6-term governor from Arkansas before winning the presidency in 1992. Among Clinton's first initiatives were his efforts to allow gays and lesbians to openly serve in the military, but ultimately Clinton devised a compromise called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," which really changed nothing. Gays and lesbians served in the military in silence both before and after the policy's enactment. Clinton also failed to pass important health measures that he had campaigned for implementing. Clinton hoped to make health care accessible to all by implementing a system of managed competition, which would create affordable private insurance paid for by employers. Critics lambasted the plan as socialized medicine, and this plan failed. Clinton succeeded in other areas, signing executive orders that allowed physicians who received federal funds to advise patients about abortion, gave military hospitals the right to perform abortions, and gave funding to UN programs that provided abortions. In 1993, Clinton signed the Family Maternity Leave Act, FMLA, which gave parents the opportunity to take 12 weeks of unpaid leave to care for newborns without risking job loss. Clinton embraced an anti-crime legislation and gun control, putting 100,000 new police officers on patrol in cities and signing the Brady Law, which banned the sale of semi-automatic weapons, and put into effect a 5-day waiting period to allow for background checks on gun purchases. Clinton appointed a number of African Americans to his cabinet, creating a, quote, rainbow administration, end quote, that was known for its diversity. Entering office in the face of a recession, Clinton's economic policies fostered growth by cutting defense spending by $500 billion, raising taxes on the wealthy and on corporations, and eliminating the federal deficit. Stocks soared, unemployment plummeted, and the gross domestic product rose. In 1993, in Western Europe, the European Union was formed, which gradually expanded and opened all of Europe to internal trade, migration, and investment. In 1999, the European Union adopted a common currency called the euro. Embracing the idea of regional cooperation, the United States, Canada, and Mexico came together in the North American Free Trade Agreement of 1994, or NAFTA, to facilitate trade. NAFTA decreased poverty rates in Mexico, but also shifted manufacturing from the United States to Mexico, which had a negative impact on American workers. Clinton also endorsed the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which facilitates trade among more than 150 nations and particularly benefits the wealthiest nations. Clinton faced fervent criticism from many right-wing talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh, who lambasted the president's wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Conservatives blamed the Clintons and their politics for the increase in feminism, abortion, affirmative action, and secularism. In addition to his policies being criticized, Clinton was beset by rumors of marital infidelity and drew critiques for a real estate deal that he and his wife were involved in before he became president. In 1994, a special prosecutor was appointed to investigate the latter accusations. In 1994, Republicans won the majority of both houses of Congress. Led by Representative Newt Gingrich of Georgia, a policy was offered called Contract with America, which called for a balanced budget, reductions in welfare and taxes, and term limits. Republicans in 1994 also enjoyed the increasing support of Christians. In response, Clinton pushed for a new welfare reform, and in 1996 he signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, ending aid to families with dependent children and requiring that adults on welfare find work within 2 years. Also in 1996, Clinton signed into law the Defense of Marriage Act, which denied federal benefits, including Social Security survivors' benefits, to same-sex couples. Clinton's rightward turn aided in his re-election in 1996 when he defeated Bob Dole and Ross Perot. Though Clinton won re-election, his own sexual indiscretions almost led to his downfall. Clinton was accused in engaging in an affair with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Clinton denied these charges under oath in front of national television audiences. However, Lewinsky's detailed testimony caused the president to recant his earlier statements. Now, it is important to note here that impeachment charges are not brought because of the affair. The impeachment charges are brought because of the dishonesty on the part of Bill Clinton. An independent prosecutor concluded that Clinton had committed perjury, and the Republican-controlled House used this charge to impeach Clinton on December 19, 1998. The Republicans in the Senate were unable to garner the necessary two-thirds to convict Clinton on the impeachment charges. Even with the scandal of his affair and the impeachment, Clinton left the country in prosperous condition and as a widely popular president. In the post-Cold War era, we see new threats, including internal conflicts in other nations, factionalism, genocide, and Islamic extremism. Clinton exercised caution and really sought to avoid involvement in many of these conflicts as they emerged around the country, around the globe. In 1994, Hutu extremists in Rwanda slaughtered more than 800,000 Tutsis and Hutu opponents. The rest of the world condemned the actions but did nothing to stop the genocide. Americans knew, the White House knew very early what was taking place in Rwanda because reports came out quickly about the events that were developing in this region of the world. And the Clinton administration issued a direct memo mandating that those in the White House not say the G word, meaning not to say genocide. Because if the White House acknowledged that there was a genocide taking place in any part of the world, because they had signed the Genocide Convention, they would be obligated to become involved. Now, many other nations in the world also have signed the Genocide Convention, but no one seemed to care about the Tutsis that are being murdered with machetes and clubs in 1994. In contrast, when conflict came about in the Balkans, the Clinton administration moved quickly to provide aid and to halt the violence. Following the Cold War, Yugoslavia had split along religious and ethnic lines, and the new nations of Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia were formed. Beginning in 1992, Serbian leader Milosevic supported the Serbs in Bosnia as they had engaged in what they called ethnic cleansing, which was the murdering of tens of thousands of Muslims. In 1995, the Clinton administration launched bombing raids against the Serbs and sent 20,000 American peacekeeping troops to the Balkans. Now, it is important to note here that many of the bombing raids that were carried out were not carried out in a very effective way. So while these bombs were being dropped, they weren't having the intended effect. The same year, Clinton facilitated the Dayton Peace Accords among Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia. And in 1999, Milosevic launched an attack on the province of Kosovo in an attempt to purge the Albanian Muslims from this region, drawing similar retribution from Clinton and NATO. Islamic extremists posed a significant threat to the United States as they waged jihad, engaging in terrorism against anyone that they perceived to be an enemy. The extremists sought to establish a caliphate or a transnational Muslim government. The United States was the target of numerous terrorist actions in the 1990s. In 1993, Islamic militants bombed the underground garage at the World Trade Center, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000. In 1998, terrorists attacked American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing hundreds and injuring thousands. In 2000, Al-Qaeda terrorists bombed the USS Cole, which was a warship that was anchored in Yemen, killing 17 soldiers. Now, here we can see these hotbeds, if you will, of ethnic cleansing and genocide throughout the 90s. In 2000, Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, ran against Texas Governor George W. Bush, son of the 41st president. Gore ran on Clinton's record, while Bush ran on a platform of compassionate conservatism, which embraced faith-based initiatives, anti-gay activism, and opposition to abortion. Bush and Gore also faced competition from the Green Party candidate Ralph Nader, who embraced grassroots action, social justice initiatives, and promised a change of pace from the other candidates who, he argued, were basically the same. Though Gore won a slim plurality of the popular vote, Bush won the electoral vote. The decisive state in the contest was Florida, where Bush won by a margin of fewer than 500 votes. So if you think your vote doesn't count, it does. In Florida, counties with heavy concentrations of poor and working class African Americans were also heavily Democratic, and they argued that they experienced roadblocks to voting. The Supreme Court halted the recount of the votes and declared Bush to be the winner. Though Bush won by only a slim margin, he governed as though he had won a large majority. Bush's base came out of the Christian community, and Bush brought faith-based initiatives to the forefront of his agenda. Between the 1970s and 2005, the large, mainly Protestant megachurches grew. In Texas, Joel Osteen preached to an audience of roughly 40,000 people each week. Bush also embraced economic conservatism, cutting taxes and putting money back in the pockets of Americans. The Bush administration deregulated business practices. In keeping with his campaign platform of compassionate conservatism, Bush continued Clinton's legacy of diversity in the presidential cabinet, including the appointment of African Americans Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, and Rod Page to very high positions, as well as appointing Latin American and Asian Americans to other positions. Policy changes included the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act, which emphasized standardized testing as a key measure for educational systems and based federal funding for schools on the outcomes. In 2003, the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act provided funding to lower the cost of prescription drugs for seniors and was a significant policy measure that reflected Bush's compassionate conservatism. Bush had little foreign policy experience and vowed to use the military solely to prevent war rather than for nation building, but he relied on his Vice President Richard Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Condoleezza Rice to guide his foreign policy. On September 11, 2001, the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon transformed Bush into a foreign policy president. Bush deployed the military forces to Afghanistan and Iraq and created a new agency called the Department of Homeland Security. Invading Afghanistan, the United States hoped to capture Osama bin Laden and overthrow the Taliban regime in favor of a pro-American government. At home, Bush pushed for the passage of the Patriot Act, which expanded the investigatory agencies in order to detect and prevent terrorist activities. Tactics included wiretapping, reading email, and searching medical and financial, as well as library borrowing records. Computer technology not only facilitated terrorist networking, it also aided in the investigatory efforts to track down those threats. In spite of the criticism of the Patriot Act, including charges that it resembled the post-World War I Red Scare measures, Congress renewed the legislation in 2006 and has subsequently renewed this legislation through today in 2020. Though the Taliban government in Afghanistan was toppled, that fight was just one piece of a much larger battle. The battle expanded into the Middle East as Bush laid the foundations for the Bush Doctrine, which argued on behalf of preventative war as a way to depose extremist governments that might threaten national security, even if the danger wasn't immediate. In January of 2002, Bush declared Iran, Iraq, and North Korea to be part of an axis of evil that was a threat to U.S. security. He determined that his administration's goals would include removing Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein from power. It would also allow the United States to attempt to dismantle Iran's radical Islamic government. In his efforts to convince the American public that Iraq warranted military intervention, he linked Saddam Hussein to the September 11 attacks and stated that Iraq was building an arsenal of weapons of mass destruction. Though an anti-war movement had some momentum, most Americans supported Bush's mission, and in March of 2003, the United States began bombing Baghdad as part of a strategy known as shock and awe. Within a few weeks, Hussein was hiding, and Bush prematurely stated that major combat operations in Iraq were complete. The war continued even without Hussein leading Iraq, and more than 4,000 U.S. soldiers died in the conflict. The U.S. invasion triggered a civil war among the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds, all of whom hoped to win power that Saddam had wielded. Although al-Qaeda was not in Iraq prior to the invasion, the instability created a ripe environment for al-Qaeda to gain influence. U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq were exhausted, undertrained, and at times very tactless in dealing with their duties. For instance, at the prison called Abu Ghraib, American soldiers took photos of themselves abusing Iraqi prisoners. Tours of duty were very long and very quickly repeated. To supplement the military's support capabilities, the United States awarded contracts to companies such as Halliburton and Blackwater, which were closely linked to the vice president. Bush won re-election in 2004 by promising to complete the war in Iraq. His opponent, Massachusetts Senator John Kerry, criticized Bush for his efforts in Iraq. In spite of Bush's promise to end the war in Iraq, violence continued, and by 2008, polls showed that 54% of Americans believed that the invasion had been a mistake and that the American troops should return home. In spite of public criticism, the Bush administration continued to carry out domestic and intelligence policies that violated the civil liberties of many people. A particular target of criticism was the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where more than 600 prisoners were subject to harsh interrogation techniques without the benefit of counsel. Though conditions at the prison improved after 2006, it remained a source of criticism. In addition to an unpopular foreign policy, the Bush administration was criticized for its slow response in addressing Hurricane Katrina, which hit Louisiana and Mississippi on August 29, 2005. The city of New Orleans was flooded and more than 50,000 people were stranded. Now, before the hurricane hit, President Bush reached out to the governors of the respective states and asked if they would like the federal aid and if they would like the U.S. military to be activated to help with evacuation and building up the areas so that the flooding would not be bad. And the governor said no. The governor turned this down. The projections did not show Hurricane Katrina being as devastating as it ended up being. And these governors, in part, felt that they could handle the situation, but the Louisiana governor was not a fan of Bush and did not want to appear to be accepting help from the president. The flood killed at least 1,800 Gulf Coast residents, and evacuees stayed in the Superdome football stadium without adequate accommodations. In 2006, the Democrats won the midterm elections and won majorities in the House and the Senate. However, very little changed. Osama bin Laden was still alive, and al-Qaeda retained strongholds in Pakistan and Yemen. U.S. enlistments were low and comprised of mainly poor young men. Though Iraq did not have easily accessible weapons of mass destruction, nuclear proliferation continued as Iran sought more nuclear weapons.